Hello and welcome to Road to ATS London. So with ATS London only 6 weeks away, we are publishing a series of videos that will help you get a flavour for what's going to be talked about on stage. Today I've got Buckman from Sublime Skinz with me to discuss his contribution to the mobile discussion, and we're going to have a chat about why we want to be positive and bullish about the future of ad tech and also kind of where the opportunities lie within the mobile space. Welcome, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Lizzie. Thanks for having me.
So, obviously, ATS London was almost 12 months ago. There's a lot has happened in that time, and there's a lot of negativity around in the industry at the moment. I want to find out kind of what the positives are, though. What do you think there is to be really positive about in ad tech?
I think as ever, growth. I mean, there is continued growth, and we're starting to finally see the consolidation we've been talking about for at least the last 3 ATSs I think I've been to. It is getting there, and despite a lot of confusion, despite GDPR throwing spanners in the works all over the place, there's still been a lot of growth. I mean, the latest IPA bellwether report is still looking at about 6.5% growth, which is maybe not as rapid as it's been in the past, but we're going off a much bigger base, and digital really is driving the growth that we're seeing just generally in marketing spend. And
what do you think that ad tech and martech technology platforms in general can actually do to help marketers and publishers make the most of the opportunity out there when it comes to digital advertising?
So I think being more exposure to the brands will be helpful. There were a couple of points raised in this morning's ExchangeWire panel where one of the panelists said that all of the major publishers meet all of the SSPs and a lot of the DSPs, and they get pitched to very regularly, and they understand what's going on a technological basis, whereas the brands themselves don't. I know a few CMOs, none of them have ever met a DSP or gone through any of the technology basis, and more of their decision making is based around what does the technology do, how much does it cost, what value does it actually add. So I think more exposure by the different vendors to the brands themselves to help them understand what the lay of the land is, and then also more cooperation to actually help them understand attribution. So I was talking to one of the agency holding groups this week. They said one of their main focuses for the rest of this year and how we can help them most is to help them understand attribution. And I think I've been having that conversation for about 20 years. And
I was going to say, it feels like it's been going on a while.
It's not new, but it's still confusing because all of the different technologies are built in silos. Everyone wants to be the new bright and shiny thing, and brighter and shiny than the one next to it. And so there's very little collaboration going on. Whereas we do actually need to be able to help brands and agencies understand where the money's being spent and how it's being spent.
It feels like, I mean, you talk about attribution being a conversation you've been talking about for the past 20 years. I mean, I completely agree. It feels like we're not really getting any further. There are some really interesting things out there and some really interesting marketers doing some amazing things with attribution, really understanding how it's not just about the business of media, but how it actually impacts their bottom line and actually impacts kind of things further than that, like engagement and loyalty. But actually, generally, there are the marketers doing that are quite few and far between in terms of being able to understand that. Do we need to take that conversation back to basics slightly and actually make people realise, look, it's not as complex as you think it is. There's easy ways around this.
Yes, absolutely. And I've been reading an interesting book recently called How Brands Grow, which is kind of a bible in sort of brand marketing. And a lot of the tenets in that are completely applicable to what we do in the ad tech space. I think we've kind of lost grip of what are the basic fundamentals of marketing, and how do you build a brand, take it out to consumers and get those consumers to buy it, and we're not very good at actually translating that to the brands themselves to help them understand where does your particular piece of ad tech fit in their value chain, and how can that actually drive different parts of the consumer's life cycle. So I think that is very important, and attribution is a part of that, but also just that kind of build up to how does each part of the chain build the consumer's relationship with the brand themselves. And what we're missing a lot, and this is often due to the format of advertising that we use digitally, is the art of storytelling in advertising.
Yeah.
So I keep harping back to Tony and Sharon of Nescafe Gold days, but there's the BT family, which is slightly
more
old.
modern day version. Yeah.
Shows my age just a little bit less. But that's a series of sequential ads, sometimes going over many years, which build a relationship between the brand and the consumer, and tie them emotionally into that brand. And there's none of that happens on the internet. It's very rare to find a series of sequential ads that assume that a group of consumers will have seen the first one and then moved on to the second one and then moves on to the third one, and actually unroll the story that's going through. And we're starting to see that a little bit more with DCO, to be able to understand who the consumer is and what they've seen and where they've reached in the life cycle of their relationship with the brand. But it's still massively underdeveloped.
It's interesting you say that, and I completely agree with you. And there's, the sequential messaging conversation feels like it's been and gone. Like it feels like it was a big topic conversation a few years ago, and then it's completely fallen off the boil. So you sort of think, oh, well, everyone must be doing it then. But obviously that's not the case. But then outside of that, I'm interested in your perspective on these new, really up and coming digital native direct-to-consumer brands that are not about the branding whatsoever, and they're not, the emotional connection is irrelevant to them, and they would argue that actually the whole brand is pointless. Why should you buy toilet paper with puppies on it? Why should you need that emotional connection? They're here to tell you the future of advertising is not brand relation. It's actually just kind of, it's price led and it's kind of convenience and everything else. Do you think that those kinds of brands will actually negate the need for storytelling, or do you think that's still a powerful element and there are many brands out there who will continue to rely on that?
Well, I think even that, it's their whole positioning is calling out to a certain emotion in their consumer target.
True.
So they are not after the people who need to see a lovely picture of a puppy to buy toilet roll. They are after a bunch of people who want a particular positioning, whether it's a price positioning or it's a cut out the middleman and I know I'm not being conned by the price of this article positioning, or whether it's kind of ecologically sound and say we do less packaging, we do less advertising, we spend less money, all we do is focus on giving you the product that you actually need. So there's a lot of that, and I think a lot of it is in response to how consumers are shifting and how they shift the way in which they buy their goods.
Interesting. And I want to shift to mobile, obviously, because that is really what we're here to talk about today. Luckily, the year of the mobile has thankfully been and gone. It was the year of mobile for about 15 years, but we've not talked about it for the past couple of years. But it still feels like we're missing a trick somewhere in mobile. And it feels like maybe, and this could just be me kind of, seeing these things, but maybe marketers and publishers are not embracing mobile as much as they maybe could or should. If you look at user engagement versus ad spend, it feels like it's still a little out of kilter. What are you seeing?
I think there's still a lot of confusion there, and it's and measurement is the issue as well. It's understanding what is the impact, how can I understand how impactful my ad is being, and too many people are still viewing that in a desktop context.
Yeah.
So they're using the same measurement tools for mobile as they have been for desktop, and saying, okay, well it's got to have a certain amount of viewability, or it's got to have a certain percentage of pixels on the page, or for a certain amount of seconds. Completely forgetting that a consumer's behaviour and the way they actually consume the content is completely different on a mobile than it is on a desktop. And the ability for anyone along the whole supply chain, from ad tech to the brand themselves, to actually measure the brand impact of a branding ad is tough. And so far, most of the pounds being spent on mobile advertising is on DR. So like you can measure it by number of installs, number of downloads, or maybe even particular sales, depending on what the app is. But there's so much more to that because of the way that the consumers are using their phones. I was reading some research this morning or yesterday about how the relationship that consumers have with their phone and the apps that are on there is changing even the way the kind of holidays they take. There's been a downfall in just lounging on a beach, soaking up the sun type holidays, and there's been an increase in kind of exercise boot camps and trekking holidays and stuff like that because they make better Instagram pics. And you can only take so many pictures of a pair of Frankfurters.
And I was hoping you'd say that. I was going to mention hot dogs if you weren't. Yeah.
And that's it. You take 14 of those during one holiday, and people switch off. But, and so getting consumers who are changing that, particularly because of how they want to share the content that they're generating and consume that.
I'm also interested in your perspective on mobile web versus in-app. You speak to, many, not going to name and shame agencies, but a lot of agency people I speak to, they say mobile web is huge for them and that's kind of where the focus is, and all the marketers they work with want to focus on mobile web. You speak to maybe app first or app only marketers and they say mobile web is dead, like everything's about in-app, and I can't understand why every other advertiser is not realising that and doing the same thing. In terms of usage, it feels like there's a lot more time being spent in-app versus mobile web. And then in terms of the way that media is bought and served, obviously it's very, very different. Is there a disconnect between mobile app and, I can't even speak now, mobile web and in-app, or actually are things kind of where they should be?
So there is a disconnect, and there's a disconnect in the way that people actually understand both of those. So all the stats are right. So the consumers will spend way more time in-app than they do on a mobile web. However, the apps that they're doing that are very limited. I mean, they're always on either in a walled garden or on a mail app, and occasionally or quite often actually on an e-commerce app. All three of those are not open to general advertising.
No.
And then finally, some publishers and editors have got good quality apps that people are actually properly bought into and are using on a regular basis, but that's quite rare. Most publishers have got a mobile website, and most of the advertising that is available to be bought on the mobile is on the mobile web. And because of the way that those are actually built versus an app which needs an SDK and needs quite a heavy install that has to be updated on a regular basis, it is actually easier to get different levels of ad tech into mobile web and to be more creative in terms of the kinds of ads that you want, and the kind of space that you use and how you play around with the interaction with the consumer.
So it's not laziness on behalf of the media buyers then that mobile web is the better place to be buying inventory versus in-app. It's actually more that there's much more you can do with it. It's more flexible and more amenable to what a marketer would be looking for from mobile advertising.
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I want to go back to what you were talking about earlier, kind of the challenge of branding on mobile, because mobile is inherently measurable, and it means that a lot of the ad dollars being spent there are DR. Is there a call for working with marketers to actually understand how they can not just use the same branding strategy they use outside of mobile and actually look at more performance branding and how they can iterate branding to actually see how it can be measurable and actually impact their bottom line?
Yeah, so that is the trick of it. So the difference between how we've always been conditioned to measure the impact of a marketing campaign has been on what is the long-term impact on a brand of doing a 3-week or 4-week television campaign. And you know that TV, you're going to hit tens of millions of people at specific times, and you can't measure it with any specificity, but you do have a general idea that 26 million people are going to be watching that particular program.
Yeah.
And anything on the internet, and particularly on mobile, is much more fragmented. So because digital advertising always had that promise of it's inherently measurable, we know how many impressions there are, how many clicks there are, but we've not actually gone very far beyond that. Being able to measure the impact on a brand over a longer period is actually quite complicated. Because it's also a sector which just changes every 5 minutes. Talking about bright, shiny things earlier on, it's like before a CMO has had a chance to decide if a particular campaign is useful, something new has come along and saying, no, you don't want to access your consumers like that, you want to access them like this.
Yeah,
and we'll tell you in 10 minutes that, yes, you've suddenly had 25 million people who've seen that and interacted with it, but the truth is that doesn't actually happen. Nothing scales, nothing really has the time to scale as much as that, and then be measured what is the true impact on the brand perception of each different product.
So there's a bit of an education piece really about what mobile can actually deliver to the branding marketers.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah. And I want to go back to our talk of sequential messaging and storytelling and understand kind of from your perspective, I guess particularly, from what Sublime Skinz is and does as well, where the value of creative is and where the opportunity for creativity lies within mobile, particularly as it pertains to the availability of data.
Yeah. So I'd actually put data on a back foot at this stage, just because there's so much that can be done with the creators and with the formats themselves. Up until quite recently, mobile advertising was basically taking the same format that worked on a desktop and just making it really, really small. You can't get anything in there. You can't get any messaging. And because it was a one-off opportunity on that particular page for a brand to get their message across, they tried to put all that messaging in that just one tiny 320 by 50 pixel banner, or sometimes an image if they were really lucky, but which is impossible. And there's no way that they can actually get a full message in that just one space. But you can get new formats. We have one of those formats, but where you can actually break it up into 2 or 3 different aspects, and you can have teaser messaging on different one, which then sort of help you sort of come into the main message itself on a larger panel, and actually encouraging the user to interact and engage with the ad. And I think better use, and this is where the technology really comes into play, is that rather than having just very large video files which take all of the consumer's data, have something which is easier to load, doesn't necessarily load everything up in advance unless the consumer requests it, so it's more respectful of their bill at the end of the month and then their time also on the on that mobile website.
Interesting.
And then gives the ability to actually expand on the story that the brand wants to portray.
Because this is the interesting thing, because not only does it it eats consumers' data, but it also means a very poor user experience for them, because things take a long time to load. It's something they don't want to see in the first place, and it just makes them more frustrated with mobile advertising. We ran our event in Singapore recently, and obviously the APAC region is a very mobile first region, but they have huge expensive data bills, and they have very low data caps. So everything that's built for that region is already built to be small and not take too much data and only load when people want it to. And it feels like, not saying that consumers have been used and abused in this market in terms of seeing how far you can push it in terms of the size of a video file, etc. But it does feel like that same methodology is starting to come over here now as consumers become more aware of what advertising is doing to their data usage. Would you say that there's kind of an opportunity for us to actually be more consumer wary when we are running mobile advertising? Yes,
definitely. Definitely. I mean, we operate also in Singapore, and we've noticed that with the first question that any agency is asking about our format is, okay, well, what's the size? How long does it take to download? And what happens if the user doesn't swipe to actually engage on the full page panel? So we had to, we'd actually built it with that in mind to start with, but it's a question that's on everyone's minds there, and it's not necessarily on anyone's mind here. It's like, I've never been asked that question here so far.
Interesting.
Because there is this assumption that because everyone's got such good data plans and we've got 4G everywhere, or they're on Wi-Fi, then it's all well and good. But it's not just the data usage; it's the processor usage of the phone as well. It's the time that it actually just takes to download everything, and consumers get frustrated with the sites because they don't necessarily understand why the brand, the site that they're looking for is not loading. It's just some of the more sophisticated will understand it's because the advertising, and then they'll download an ad blocker, and then we've just lost them forever.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to save some of this conversation for the stage at ATS London. So my final question to you is kind of, what are the key things that you hope and expect to be the big talk of ATS London this year?
6 weeks is a long time in ad tech.
Isn't it just?
Yes. So I'm expecting us to be talking about another new big piece of consolidation, something big that's happened. I think this. Do
you have word on the grapevine? Or
no,
you're just speculating?
Not. I'm just no. I've got hopes, but no. Yeah. But I think there will be movement in the SSP and DSP areas, and there's a lot of telcos that have been active, and there's still more to be active. So I think there's opportunities there. I'd like to see talk about how agencies are looking at their model and how they're reacting to external impacts on that. And then, of course, I've heard that mobile panel is going to be particularly exciting.
I've heard the same thing too.
Yes, yeah.
I want to say thank you very much for coming in today, Andrew. Really good conversation. And yeah, more to be discussed on this at ATS London on the 10th of September. There are tickets still available, so buy them now because they're going quickly. Thank you again.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thanks.